very well. So, I wonder if I can say that or if not.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for making it to Onward's event on tax. What a lovely thing to see such a packed room, people only standing behind. I'm Shivani H. Menon. I'm the Deputy Head of Research at Onward. Since the start of the year, the topic of tax, will it go up, will it go down, what kinds of tax should be cut, which ones should we bring back, has been the subject of widespread buzz, and the election environment has charged the conversation even further. But 3 months on from the general election, the Conservative Party faces a tax battle on two fronts. First, there is this mystical £22 billion figure that Labour's put forward, and the Conservative Party has been questioning it, rightly so. And on the second front, a lot of defectors from the Conservative Party have mixed views on tax. On one side, people want lower taxes on low and middle income individuals, and on the other, they want much more spending to go into our public services. So there's a dilemma in front of the Conservative Party at the moment. To talk about this, we've assembled a stellar panel. To my right, we have Nick Timothy MP, who is the MP for West Suffolk. He's former Downing Street Chief of Staff, and you'll see his columns very frequently on The Telegraph and The Critic. To my very right, we have Gemma Tetlow, the Chief Economist at the Institute for Government. She leads their work on public finances and is a regular commentator on radio and television. To my left, we have Kate Andrews, the economics editor at The Spectator. She was the associate director for the Institute of Economic Affairs and was the head of comms at the Adam Smith Institute and used to work on the Romney presidential campaign in 2012. To my very left, we have Arun Advani, the director for the Center for the Analysis of Taxation, CENTAX, who is kindly supporting this event today. Arun is an associate professor of economics at the University of Warwick and a research fellow at the IFS. So how we'll structure this event is we'll hear opening remarks from each of the panelists for about 5 minutes or so. Then we'll open up the panel to questions from the audience, try to make this as interactive as possible. With that, let's get the conversation started. Nick, over to you. What do you think the future of the Conservative Party's vision, or nice centre-right policy on tax, what does that look like?
Okay, thank you, and thanks for having me. I think at this conference and in the couple of years ahead, we have to have a really frank conversation with ourselves about why we lost. The election result was complex in lots of ways. It's highly unusual that the governing party should win 2/3 of the seats with 1/3 of the vote. There's obviously surges for reform. The Lib Dems finally learned to love first past the post. But the singular story, I think, of the election campaign was that in most parts of the country, most people wanted us gone. And that's why the result fragmented in different ways. It's why the Lib Dems prospered in some places, why Labour beat us in the seats where it mattered most. And this is not rock bottom. Rock bottom is zero. So we need to be really honest with ourselves about the situation we're in and how we need to change. And we actually have an interesting difficulty before us because Labour are really bad. And them being bad is not necessarily good for us because it may tempt us down paths that we should try to avoid. And when Keir Starmer isn't on Savile Row or going to football matches or Taylor Swift concerts, they are obviously planning to rinse the country with tax rises. And Rachel Reeves, as we've learned in the papers in the last week or so, has been told the truth by the Treasury, which is you can't raise the sums of money they think they need just by taxing small numbers of supposedly very rich people or non-doms or whatever. They're going to have to tax ordinary people if they're going to raise the sums they need. Now, this is a political opportunity for us because they've been dishonest. They didn't campaign on this basis. Their so-called fiscal hold that they've identified is a myth. It is a combination of usual in-year spending pressures, which I remember very well when I was working in the Home Office and the Treasury started saying you need to now make savings even though this wasn't what we discussed during the last spending review. These things happen. It was a combination of those in-year spending pressures and their own decisions on public sector pay. And we are going to pay for it through tax rises. And we should hit them hard about that, but we should avoid the temptation to rush too early into a kind of radicalism on tax that we may later regret, because the politics of tax are very complicated. So the public don't like excessive taxation, obviously, but they also expect well-funded public services. The Trussonomics experiment, as anybody who was on the doorstep during the election campaign knows, was utterly toxic for us. And Labour will control the narrative in a way that they didn't when they were in opposition. The baseline changes. When you're in government, you can talk about what the opposition might do and raise the spectre of Labour tax rises. The opposite will be true with a Labour government and a Tory opposition, where any uncertainty about your plans will be translated into not tax rises but Tory cuts. Now, this is all fine so long as we have a properly thought out plan in the years ahead. At the moment, we've got to get the sort of foundations right, but we've got to do these things in a knowing way. We've got to understand what our approach is, and when it comes to having specific policies, they've got to be properly copper-bottomed. And we can make the case for lower taxes because while I'm somebody who has argued that the party needs to not be totally down on the state. I once wrote a line about the good that government can do that was given by a prime minister. But lower taxes are still part of the way we see the world, because we believe in trusting people more than we believe in trusting bureaucrats and the state. We think tax cuts in the right places are good for the economy, and we know that when the state, I believe in a strong and strategic state, but I believe in a smaller state, because when the state's too big, it gets unwieldy and it's ineffective. So I wrote a column in the Telegraph yesterday. It's every Monday. That's the day you should buy the Telegraph. In which I said that there's a set of principles that I just propose that the party could consider as an approach to its tax policies. First off, tax cuts aren't an end in themselves. The first thing we should be talking about is actually we want to see a good society. And the second is a good society needs a strong economy, but a strong economy needs more than tax cuts. That can be part of it, but actually we need fiscal responsibility. The third one is that actually the really overwhelming problem with our economy, and maybe we can talk about some of this in the ensuing debate, is that we haven't been growing at a sufficient rate for a very long time, certainly since the financial crash. And my personal view is we need a different economic model. We need to reindustrialise. We need to narrow the trade deficit. And to do those things, yes, we need an active state, an interventionist state in some respects, but we need more investment, private investment and public investment. The fourth one is we do need to reform public services and make sure that they're as efficient as possible. There are parts of public life that can be just swept away. Charles Moore revealed in the Telegraph, I mean, they do pay my wages, so Charles Moore revealed in the Telegraph at the weekend that it's now law that if you own a single chicken, you have to register that with the state. We're definitely doing things a bit excessively. So there are some things that we can strip away, but obviously that is not the be-all and end-all of reform. But while we do need reformed public services, we do also need to recognise that there is rising demand with an ageing society for health, social care, pensions, and with the world more dangerous, we're going to need to spend more on our security as well. So while we can work to make things more efficient, we are going to need to make sure that those things are properly funded. The fifth is that in the end, it will be growth that realises the potential for tax cuts. In the short term, it's specific acts of reform that will allow us to do that. And the sixth is if we're reforming taxes and we're able to find ways to reduce taxes in a targeted way. Labour, when they want to pile on the tax rises, talk about sin taxes. We should be talking about virtue tax cuts, and we should be prioritising behaviour that we think is virtuous. So the tax cuts that we do end up focusing on, I think, should be about rewarding and encouraging innovation, investment, and families, and the ability of young people to form families and have children and bring them up.
Thank you very much, Nick. I'd like to come to you next, Kate. Nick touched on the idea that tax cuts alone won't be enough, that perhaps there's an order of sequencing. You grow the economy first, then offer tax cuts. Could I get your thoughts on this? What comes first, what comes second?
Broadly speaking, I agree. I was going to feel bad asking the audience to go back to October 2022, but you already mentioned it, so I'm going to go there. When that fateful mini budget was announced, and then it so quickly blew up. And when it blew up, the argument, I think to the detriment of probably most people's thinking in this room, if you are conservative, if you are on the right, if you are a classical liberal, you probably think that the state at the moment is a bit too big in some way or another. The tragic thing for anyone who thinks that way is that it became incredibly easy for the rest of the world to say, that's what happens when you try to implement tax cuts. And the mini budget did not blow up because of the tax cuts. It didn't blow up for the reasons that the former Prime Minister makes either. And as she was doing at Tory party conference yesterday, it didn't blow up because the Bank of England was out to get her. It did not blow up because the Office for Budget Responsibility was out to get her. They would have needed to have known what was in the mini budget, which she made sure they didn't if they were out to get her. It didn't blow up because of the blob. It blew up because of outrageous spending requests. A £100 billion request to the markets to fund what were essentially price controls on energy. And it didn't end up costing that much, but that was pretty much what was being asked for in that mini budget. And I think that this is an important sequence here, and this is where I agree with Nick. If you want to talk about tax cuts in a country that just hit a terrifying milestone of debt reaching over 100% of GDP as a percentage, you have to talk about spending first. You don't get the tax cuts, that they are the reward at the end. You don't get the tax cuts before you start talking seriously about spending and quite a few other things too. Anyone, any party leadership hopeful, any MP, any commentator who's talking about slashing tax and not also talking about spending restraint, not also talking about building lots and lots and lots of homes and spending the political capital to do that, that isn't talking about reforming the NHS, that isn't talking seriously about the state pension, and that isn't talking seriously not just about tax cuts, but tax simplification, then they're not serious about delivering tax cuts. And if I may be so bold as to be slightly critical of the Tory manifesto, first of all, it wasn't reducing the tax burden. It was slowing the rate at which it was rising. Yes, some taxes were being cut, but the overall tax burden, had the Tories got back into power for a fifth term, was still rising from where it was, already at a 70-year record high. It was also promising to respect the triple lock on the state pension, right? It had absolutely no agenda for NHS reform. These are really tricky things to talk about at the best of times, let alone when you're asking people to vote for you. But to say that you're going to slash tax in a budget where you're not talking about spending and you're not talking about reform isn't very serious. There are areas where I think Nick and I would disagree, especially on the point about trade deficits and tariffs and more protectionism. The UK is in desperate need of more private investment. There isn't money in the coffers to do a lot of public investment. The last thing businesses want to hear is that you're going to double down on protectionism. There might be some good reasons to have certain levels of national industry ramped up. I think about the steel industry, for example. I think we should move that into a completely different sphere of debate. We should be talking about steel as part of the defense budget, not as an industry that is going to see the economy grow or that's going to be really great for GDP in the long term. That's not realistic, that's not true, but if we want to talk about it as necessary for procurement and defense, let's just be honest about that. Let's have that conversation and decide if that's worthwhile. I wouldn't personally start going down the trade deficit route. But a lot of things are going terribly wrong, including the fact that the UK is taxing and spending at record levels, and yet everything is falling apart, right? It is taxing you more, it is spending more, it is continuing to spend way outside of its means, and this was the trajectory before the pandemic. The pandemic made it a lot worse, but it was still the trajectory. And yet, kids' school roofs are falling in. You or someone you know will be waiting months on end to see a GP, to get their appointment, to have quite necessary surgery. We are in a situation where so much is being taken. The state is actually so bloated, it's doing so much, and yet people wouldn't believe you if you told them that. They would say, what on earth? No, we must be throwing pennies at this. No. Billions upon hundreds of billions of pounds are being thrown into a lot of these institutions, and people aren't getting results. So in order to get those results, and then I think to lead to, ultimately, not even a smaller state, but I mean, ideally, you would want the state to be a smaller percentage of GDP than it is now, or spending a smaller percentage. But to have, let's even just start with a more efficient state, to have the money that you're giving over spent more efficiently, and then to talk about the tax cuts, then to talk about making things smaller. You have to talk about reform. You have to talk about simplification, and you have to talk about spending. Then I think we get to have the conversation about tax cuts.
Thank you very much, Kate. Audrun, I'm going to come to you next. We've heard from Nick about tax cuts. Kate brought up too much spending. Clearly, there's three choices ahead of any government. You cut spending, you increase taxes, or you increase borrowing. You've looked at the evidence, so dare I say, politics aside for a second, what is the right thing to do? Is there one?
I think there isn't a single right thing to do, but there are definitely wrong things to do. I think, as Kate pointed out, the decision 2 years ago to go to the markets and say we're going to need huge amounts of borrowing and we don't have a plan for at what point we're going to stop needing borrowing. We're just going to borrow and we'll keep borrowing. And actually maybe we're about to do more, but we're not telling you exactly what, which was the sort of doubling down by the then Chancellor, was something that was terrifying. Right? Nobody knew what the plan was. I think that speaks to where we are now. As Shivani said out at the start, the Conservative Party, the Conservative government just lost an election. It's now got 4 or 5 years out of power, and it needs to think about where it's going to go over the next 5 years. Part of what it will have to say on tax and do on tax will be reactive. It doesn't have the levers anymore to control what the tax regime looks like. A lot of what it will do will be reactive to what Labour is saying. But another part of what it needs to do now is to think about how to develop a distinctive Conservative agenda for what does tax reform look like in the future. Both because, as an opposition party, what it is there to do is to hold the government to account, to say where the government is doing things wrong and where it could do better, and because when it comes up to an election, it will need to be in a position to say, here is what we will do differently. And that means, very importantly, as Kate set out, and as Nick set out, having a serious think about what is the Conservative view on government spending, what size of states do we want. Some of the reasons that the state has grown are hangovers from the pandemic of things that we started doing and we now are doing. A lot of what the pressure on the size of the state is things that are coming down the track anyway. There is somehow deciding what we're going to do about infrastructure, which we haven't spent that much on for a long time, and we have to decide, do we want some of it to crumble? Do we want to try and convince the private sector to fund it and privatize it? Or do we want the state to spend it? We have to work out, what are we doing about having an aging population? What are we doing about pensions and social care? We have to decide what we're doing. Again, people take different views on this, but what are we doing about net zero? Do we want to be investing in a large scale to try to have to decarbonize our economy or not? Those are all questions to which the choice will ultimately be for the party and the public when they get to vote for the party or not, around what the Conservative agenda is. But it's important to set out that agenda and work out what does that mean in terms of where the tax system needs to be. There are kind of two different questions the Conservative Party has to answer for itself ahead of the next election. And it'll be doing this, for the first time in 14 years without the civil service there for, whatever you think of them, the ability to go and run the numbers for you and come up with, here's what will happen if you do this, Minister. The first question is, what is the size of the state that you want to have? And that, I think, as both Nick and Kate said, should start with, what do you want the state to do? What do you want the state not to do? And then how are you going to pay for that? Rather than starting with we want to reduce the size of the state by cutting taxes, and then we have to figure out somehow what that means on the spend side. That's the wrong way around. Mm-hmm. The second thing that the party needs to do is, whatever the size of the state is, whatever it picks on that, think about what is a functioning tax system, what's a well-performing tax system, Right now we have a relatively large, compared to where we have been, although fairly average by OECD standards, size of state in terms of the tax take that we have. But it's a very badly designed thing, and it's not, that's not a view about what the Conservatives did for the last 14 years, nor is it what Labour did for the years before. It has slowly, through the accretion of various tweaks and things, got to the point where it's full of all kinds of weird corners and quirks that don't work very well. One thing that's important for the Conservatives to do is to set out where do we think the current tax system, even if you're going to tax as much as you do now, could be done better. Are all of the reliefs that are available at the moment the right ones? Is there good evidence for them? I think it's important, Nick pointed out the need for growth as part of the answer. I think that's essential. And it really may be the case that we want certain tax breaks in the system to encourage people to take certain actions that will lead to that investment, that innovation, that growth. The Labour government, a month ago or 2 months ago, renewed a series of tax breaks we currently have, the Enterprise Investment Scheme, the Venture Capital Trust, and said, okay, if all of everyone picking up on winter fuel allowances, that was £3 billion they just agreed to spend on extending those schemes. We still have no evidence on the value for money of those schemes. Maybe they're fantastic, maybe they work really well, in which case that's great, and maybe we should be doing more of them. Maybe they are not working very effectively, and a lot of the money goes to people who are not. It's really important that we have evidence on that, and for a Conservative Party outside of power, an important thing that it can be doing is holding the government to account over those things. Part of that will have to be partnering with other organisations in the think tank space. Onward is clearly one of the partners. Hopefully we at Centax, as an independent research organisation that's here to think of how do you improve the tax system, can be another one. But really to look at what's the evidence base for different parts of things we have in the tax system now. Because separate from that conversation we all have to have about spending and tax, we also need a conversation about how do we make the tax system do the things we want it to do? Where is it not doing that? And how can we improve those things? And so I hope over the next few years, an important part of the agenda for the Conservatives is not just reacting to the weather as Labour says this is what we're doing and that's what we're doing, but is also setting out a distinctive agenda that thinks of what it wants the tax system to achieve, how it wants to achieve them, and puts in place now over the coming years a plan so that when it comes closer to an election, the Conservative Party is in a position to say, actually, we have something distinctive to say. We have a plan. Here are the things that we would do, and here is the evidence we have for why they would work. And that's why you should trust us, again, with your money and with your vote. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Arun. I'm going to come to you now, Gemma. Arun's put forward these big questions on what Conservatives should answer while in opposition. How do we act on those priorities?
Sure. So I think just to sort of agree with some of what's already been said and spell out a bit more. So the reason the tax burden has been going up has been to pay for the costs of providing a welfare state to an increasingly aged population. That's a long-running trend, but for a long time post-war, we were able to pay for that out of declining defence spending and then latterly declining debt interest spending as debt interest costs fell. Those things are no longer helping us, and therefore we are facing increasingly the difficult choice of if we want to keep funding those things, what are we going to stop doing, or where are we going to find the extra tax revenues to pay for that? And I think to sort of get into the detail of tax policy of why tax take has been going up in recent years, it's been a combination of some headline-grabbing tax cuts on things like NICs and fuel duty, but at the same time some less noticed expansion of tax, in particular through freezing thresholds and things. And I think that speaks to what Arun was saying about how our tax system develops over time, which is that because a lot of the political debate around tax can be quite poor quality or superficial, governments often reach for the things that are less obvious when they get announced, but over time create a lot of distortions within the tax system. So I think I would agree with what both Nick and Arun and Kate have said about for the Conservative Party. I think what was noticeable for me going into both the 2019 and 2024 elections was there was very little difference between Labour and the Conservatives in terms of the state offer that was being put forward in those manifestos. And therefore, for the Conservatives, that was not consistent with offering a significant lower tax burden because you were offering the same shape and size of the state. So I think looking forwards, if you want to have a significantly lower tax as part of the offer, then that has to go along, as has already been said, with some serious thought and kind of being open about what are we going to do less of alongside that. If not, then we are much more in the world of what's the structure of the tax system within the current tax take. But I think it's important to think not of the tax burden, not just the headline number of how much are we raising, but actually the true burden of tax on the economy. it also matters what the detail of that tax policy is. And there are lots of ways in which the tax system as it currently stands distort or discourage economic activity. And there are lots of things that Arun and others have pointed out that you could raise the same amount of money in a way that would be much less distortive to economic activity. Nick talked about wanting to incentivise good things through the tax system. That's definitely one question to ask yourself. I think it's also important to go back a step and think, are we at least not discouraging or disincentivising things that we're not intending to disincentivise? And there are lots of ways in which the tax system do create incentives to do things one way rather than another way for no obviously good reason. So there are strong incentives to incorporate yourself, to pay yourself as a company owner manager rather than to be employed or self-employed because you pay less tax that way. Do we really think we want people to spend time and effort doing that because the tax system is incentivising them? Maybe not. With full expensing, we now have strong incentives to debt financing investment rather than equity financing investment. Again, is that something we want to do? So 3 things I would encourage the Conservatives to do during this period in opposition. Similar to Arun, I'd say take a strategic view of the tax system. Where do you think the current tax system is imposing unnecessarily large economic harms? What's the evidence? Strongly agree with Arun. Do look at the great quality and increasingly deep sort of depth of knowledge outside government on the state of the tax system. Which policies do you think are most important to change, whether to remove unintended distortions or to create incentives that you think are positive? And potentially, if that involves reducing taxes in one area, where are you willing to raise taxes to pay for the other services that you want? So that's number 1, take a strategic view. Secondly, I think the scope for the Conservatives in opposition to use, once you have that strategic view, you know where you think the tax system is currently weakest, use that as a way of challenging the government as well. Often the parliamentary debate around tax is very reactive. It's very driven by what MPs are getting into their post bags, which may not necessarily be the most important tax issues for the country. And one of the reasons that I think governments tend to go for those tax changes that are less noticed by people is because they get pressure on certain types of things, but they get much less challenge on others. So I think if the Conservatives in opposition can actually do more to say, not just challenge the new announcements the government is making, but to say, actually, there's these bits of the tax system that have for a long time been really weak. Why are you not doing anything about that? I think is an opportunity for the Conservatives in opposition. And thirdly, I think whilst the Conservatives may take ideologically different views from Labour about how much revenue should be raised or who should be redistributed towards or from, I think there's nonetheless also a role for the Conservatives in opposition of taking the government's stated objectives at face value, but challenging them out on, are you actually achieving this in the best way that you could, I think is also an area where you could help to improve the quality of tax policy during this period of opposition.
Great. Thank you very much, Gemma. Before we open up to questions, I might do a quick fire round with our panelists. Tomorrow...
You didn't tell us about that.
Sorry. I just thought about it because we spoke about winter fuel, IR35, EIS, we spoke about national insurance. Tomorrow you are made Chancellor. You have one tax lever to pull. What is it? Shall we go left to right?
And do I need to be popular at the end of it?
Depends. I have a feeling this is going to prompt questions afterwards. So,
I mean, if I wanted one thing that would raise a lot of money and be better for the tax system, but would be throwing away all popularity I might have briefly had if I were made Chancellor, it would be expanding VAT to cover all spending. There's a lot of spending that isn't covered by VAT. It is effectively a subsidy to the people who spend the most on those things. And so people will say, oh, you're increasing the cost of food for poor people. And you say, yes, but we're raising many tens of billions of pounds, maybe something like 50, 70 billion pounds. And if our concern is there are low-income people who are going to struggle, we have a lot of money we can now use, some of which can be to deal with that problem, some of which can be to deal with other challenges that we have. It's not the most sexy, popular thing to do, and I'm certainly going to be voted out immediately. I'll have, if it's Keir, then it's Keir will throw me out the next day. But I think it's if you've got one thing to do and you want to raise a lot of money quickly, that would be it. And you can use it then to achieve the other priorities around. You can use that to cut income taxes. You can use that to have investment incentives. You can use it for those things. So it doesn't mean you have to spend all the money on the size of the state. It's just a way of raising money that is better than one of the things that we do now, and we can use it for fixing other problems. And that doesn't have to mean a bigger state. It just means a better design state.
You thought of the answer to your question in a much more responsible way. I thought of what I would cut. Although I think it would have, to Gemma's point, what are we disincentivizing at the moment? Well, we're disincentivizing people to live in homes that suit the moment. And I would scrap stamp duty immediately. What a distortive tax. It keeps people in homes that are far bigger than they need to be. It stops people from having larger families. It means that friends who are my age or a bit younger than me, when they're thinking about getting on the housing ladder, a lot of them, they're certainly not in a position to buy a 2 or 3 bed home yet, but that's what they want to do. They want their first purchase to be their family home. This is simply not the case in most developed societies. The idea that the first property purchase would be the one where you're going to have 2 children is frankly nuts. The idea that buying a 1-bedroom apartment is actually going to penalize you financially, because if you buy more than 2 homes over the course of your life, you're really losing out, is utterly ridiculous. So I'd scrap stamp duty. Thanks, guys.
Nick.
Well, I think basically we need to remove disincentives and create incentives for the things that we want, and housing is a really good example of that. We are highly dysfunctional when it comes to things like housing, building infrastructure, and so on. I would say absolutely anything that gets us investing in plant and machinery that helps us to reindustrialize and rebalance our economy, and to remove the incentives that encourage really promising young, small to medium-sized companies to sell prematurely. Because this country is brilliant at innovation, and it's not very good at taking companies through to a particular size. And it's when companies grow to a particular size that we get much more research and development and investment of that kind. And that happens partly because the tax incentives point people to sell up at that kind of stage of a company's development, which is one of the reasons why I am interested in the trade deficit, because a lot of our problems go back to the trade deficit, because when you run a trade deficit, you risk a current account deficit, that risks the value of your currency, so then you have all these perverse incentives to encourage foreign money into the country to sustain the currency, and that's why we lose a lot of control of our industry.
Gemma?
This is the trouble with going last, because Kate and Arun have taken 2 of the things I would have gone for. But to add a third one, which also won't get me elected, I would address the difference in our tax treatment of different forms of work. We tax people who happen to do their work as employees much more heavily once you take into account employers and employees' national insurance than we do self-employed people, and even more then again than we do company owner managers. There's no good reason for that. It's not clear that those tax incentives drive better economic activity. It just encourages people to choose the structure of their work to maximise their tax advantages. So I would address that one.
Lovely. Shall we now move on to Q&A? I'm going to start with questions on this side of the room and then go over there. Could we get the gentleman at the very back? Whoever's got Niles. And we'll do the gentleman here as well. Take them in batches of 2. If you could state your name, which organization you're from, and keep your question as short and sharp as possible, that'd be fantastic.
Hi, my name is Vijay. I'm from Harrow East. So I work in the city, and there is a misconception among the Westminster that people with the broad shoulders, especially paying the top rate, they can take the hit in terms of the growing taxes every year. I believe we need to be strong in terms of cutting the taxes rather than increasing it. What's your view on it?
Thank you. So we have a question on top rate of tax. Is it too high? And a question right here. Thank you.
So Charles Prestory, Southampton Conservatives. Should national insurance be extended to other forms of income, so pension income, dividend income, that kind of thing? Essentially, should national insurance be harmonised and rolled into income tax? It would strike me that with an ageing population, contribution towards social care costs and all of that stuff, why is it justified that old age income effectively isn't contributing via national insurance or paying tax, whatever way you want to look at it in that way? Thank you.
Great, thank you. So 2 questions on top rate of tax. Is it too high, and should we be harmonizing national insurance contributions? I'm going to ask the economists to jump in first and then talk to people with politics and economics on their briefs. Often I find the answers to these questions tend to be quite different. So Gemma and Aaron first.
Do you want to go for it?
So I would say on the, should we extend national insurance contributions? Yes, we should extend to all forms of income. It's part of the harmonising income tax. If you do that, you could take 2p off the income tax rate for everybody. So it doesn't mean a bigger state. It just means a better designed state. It means we get rid of some of these distortions in terms of different ways people work. It is a tax increase for some people. It's a tax saving for others. But it is a fairer system in the sense that you're treating all people equally, independent of where their income is coming from. It is kind of a nonsense that someone working full-time on the minimum wage pays national insurance contributions and then they pay rent to their landlord and their landlord doesn't. That's a very strange system. On the top rate of tax, the economic evidence is that from a fiscal perspective, it doesn't raise lots of extra money. It wouldn't lose a lot of money to increase it a bit or to decrease it a bit. So it then is really a question that's more for the political side of how much redistribution do you want to do, because it is taking from slightly higher income people to lower income people. I don't think my view as an academic is particularly important on that one. I think just where I would go is, can you design that well? I mean, you sort of touched on the top rate of tax. I think the another question is, what do you think the top rate of tax is? It is not 45p, right? We know there are parts of the income distribution where it's 60. There are parts where it's even higher when you account for the withdrawal of childcare allowances and student loans. There's all sorts of other things that are in there. So if I were going to deal with the top rate of tax, it wouldn't be worrying about 45p at 150,000 or 125,000 now. I'd be much more worried, and I am much more worried about the full withdrawal of access to childcare at £100,000. I am much more concerned about those sorts of things, because there the evidence is much stronger that is creating distortions. So top rate of tax is a problem, but the place to look is not the 45p rate. That's not where the top rate of tax is.
Thank you. Gemma?
So basically, agree. I mean, on the sort of top rate of tax, one thing that was very noticeable under the last Conservative government was it was actually they increased the tax burden on highest earners, which is perhaps not what you would have expected from a Conservative government. And if you look at the UK compared to other countries that raise more in tax than we do, it's not that they tax high income, high wealth people more. It's actually that the bulk of people in the middle of the income distribution pay more tax. So I think we do need to be realistic about, if we want to raise any more in tax, that you do need to think about everyone paying it. We can't pretend that there's some magic group who are going to pay and the rest of us don't have to. On NICs, yes, if I had my ideal world, I would roll income tax and NICs together for the same reason that Arun said. I mean, I suppose one of the there's been a lot of debate about pensions tax relief in the run-up to this budget, but actually one of the significant genuine reliefs that you get on pension contributions is for employer contributions. You never pay NICs on that. So actually that's the sort of thing which doesn't really make sense. The income tax relief is really tax smoothing. You don't pay it now, but you pay it when you take it out. But the NICs difference in treatment doesn't really make sense. That is a genuine subsidy to people. So I think if we had those two together and we got rid of the pretense that NICs is anything to do with contributions to benefits, which it clearly isn't anymore, that would be a better system.
Great. Kate and Nick, whoever would like to come in first.
Ladies first.
Thank you. I completely agree on marginal tax rates. I mean, so many of them are just unacceptable, and you wouldn't have designed it that way. They're accidents. They're accidents by design, or designs by accident. That is absolutely where you would start looking. The disincentive to want to earn more money in a country that, as Nick says, is incredibly innovative and ambitious is ridiculous. So I think that is where you would look first. And just follow on from Gemma's point, there is an irony here that the history of 15 years of Tory legacy has been to take relatively low-paid people and average workers to a better place on tax, and actually the increase has been at the top. I'm not putting any good or bad weight on that. It's a choice, but it's just a choice that if you were to say that to someone, they would probably say, you're wrong. Of course that's not what happened. Of course they gave everybody at the top a tax break. That's simply not the case. And it speaks to perhaps part of the reason, a small part of the reason why things went so wrong on July the 4th, that The Tories have become incredibly muddled in their narrative on tax, so muddled that they weren't even able to put forward a very clear, straightforward narrative about what they did do on tax, which a lot of average earners and low-paid workers would have probably liked to hear. And on NI, I mean, I think the Tories were onto something by trying to essentially scrap it, but merge it with income tax. I mean, income tax might have to rise slightly, but the idea is that overall it would be a lower tax burden. NI is a myth. That money is not going into a special pot to pay for your pension one day and for the NHS. It's not going into any pot. It's going into the Treasury's coffers along with everything else, and it's paying for day-to-day spending. And I completely understand when people get to retirement age, when people need the NHS towards the end of their life, why they would say, but I have paid in, because that's what they've been told. They have paid in, but their money's not in a pot somewhere with their name on it. It's gone. And current taxpayers are paying for that day-to-day spend. That is completely unsustainable. So we should get rid of this illusion to start, be more honest, simplify, and then go from there.
Great. Nick, is NI really a double tax? Are we taxing people twice?
Yeah, I think national insurance is a really bad tax for all the reasons given. It's also it's not progressive. We can use the word progressive in a good way sometimes. It is a bad tax, and I think we were onto something in our plans to say that it should be abolished and to some degree rolled into income tax. I mean, just on the point that about the changing shape of taxation under the Conservatives, it's not only the case that the richest people in the country paid more tax over the last 14 years. It's also that people on typical incomes paid less. And when somebody wrote this in a column or something not long before the election, and it wasn't me, not plugging my own work this time, and it went around some Conservative advisors and MPs and ministers, people saying, "Is this true?" And we didn't know. Now that says something about, I think, the chopping and changing of the last 14 years, where there's just not a single narrative for that period, and people, maybe didn't feel ownership of some policies from previous prime ministers and chancellors, and wanted to go down different routes. But that's crazy that we got ourselves into a position where actually for lots of people that's quite a good news story. And obviously people in the end judge what they feel rather than what they're told. But it's odd. It's very odd that we didn't know that. The other thing I would say about this, and this may be about to continue with further questions. This is precisely the danger that we face as a party now, because we're going to be shorn of our real responsibilities to publish actual budgets, and we're going to say, well, we're a low tax party and we're facing a government that's taxing too much, and then there'll just be this endless shopping list of taxes that we don't like, that we'd like to cut or abolish or so on. And we've got to be very careful about that, because it wouldn't be credible to start listing all these different taxes that we would abolish. Whatever we say has to be credible. It has to be part of a proper story, a proper understanding of the role of the state, what we want to do with the state, where we want to cut it, where we want to reform it, and how we want to reform the tax system, which inevitably, it should be the case that as part of those reforms that we put forward, we will cut some taxes, and we will want, in the end, the overall tax burden to be reduced. But we must not get ourselves into a position where we think the response to Labour putting up taxes is that we start producing shopping lists of unrealistic tax cuts for ourselves.
Great. Questions from this side. Could we get the gentleman at the front and the lady just in the middle? Thank you.
Hi, I'm a relatively new GP and working 3 days a week. I'm not burnt out, and I would be happy to work more. But I'd basically be doing it for charity. I would earn almost no money if I worked that fourth and fifth day, and so I don't. Is there a way of the Tory party going into the next election with a plan that would allow me to work those days and keep a bit more of the money that I would earn on those days, without it being unrealistic or political suicide.
Making work pay. Next question, please. Thank you.
Hi, I wanted to ask a question about a possible area of expansion or indeed reform, which is social care. And I was particularly interested, not least with the panelists we have, about where they think the Conservatives should go on offering a new deal of some sort on social care, how they might react to Labour proposals on that, with both the what should the offer be, whatever, and how to pay for it.
Great. So we have two questions on making work pay and reform to social care. I'll just open it up to the panel.
Who wants to jump in?
I mean, on the making work pay, I think it comes back to what we were saying earlier about marginal rates. I agree that some of the marginal rates are just silly. And again, the distinctive thing that the Conservatives will have to offer when they think about saying we want to fix that is, here is how, just as Nick was cautioning, here is how we're going to pay for it. Here's how we can afford to do this. It can't be, we think marginal rates are too high and we're going to just cut them, and we have no idea how that's going to work. It has to be, here's how we do it. But I think it is an important thing to consider. It seems like a very obvious thing for the Conservatives to push on if Labour aren't doing it anyway, and that they should be holding Rachel to account in the budget in a month's time if there is no movement on that kind of thing, saying, look, you're talking about growth, you're talking about investment, where is the evidence that you're doing some of the things that we know are a barrier? On the point about social care, I think it comes back to this question of actually what does the Conservative Party, when it's thinking out policy, want the system to look like? One answer is, this is an entirely private system, we should move more of this into the private space. That means that the government won't have to cover as much of it, but we leave people to fend for that. If that's not where you want to be, then you are going to have to work out how to pay for it, and that's always been the barrier since the Dilnot review, more than 10 years ago, where that set out, here's a plan for social care, here's what, it was commissioned by a Conservative government. They said, give us a plan for how you pay for social care, because it's eating up all of local government. If any of you are councillors, you'll know that your local council is spending all of its money basically on social care, and it has no money left over for anything else that it needs to do, and it's probably closing libraries and selling off parks to be able to pay for social care, because it has a statutory duty to do that. Well, yeah, exactly, because there's a statutory duty to deliver social care, but without any of the money that's needed. Yeah. We need to be realistic about that, and if that statutory duty is going to stay in place, and that's what needs to be delivered, then there has to be a source of paying for it. I mean, one answer to that is, since it's funded through local government, is to solve council tax. I mean, we know that I think whatever we all think about the way in which, about various parts of council tax, I don't think any of us can explain a reason why you'd want council tax to be based on the value of houses in 1991. That's just madness that we're still there. It does also probably need to raise some more money from council tax if you're going to use that to pay for social care, or you have a different plan for it. But I do think we need to connect the dots between the spend side and the tax side, as we've said already.
Great. Nick, did you want to come in on social care?
No, I really don't want to talk about social care. I think it's the elephant in the room, really, because we do have this ageing society. The ageing society is such a big driver of the change in the levels of revenues that we need to raise through taxes. It's a big part of the explanation for the struggles of the NHS. And it needs to be addressed. Now, I'm not going to put forward a proposal right now. I think the system needs to be properly funded, and we've got to work out what the fair way of doing that is. In 2017, we had a suggestion which wasn't very popular, and I think the honest reflection on that is that the proposal didn't do enough to pull risk, which spooked people. The sector itself needs lots of reform, including proper workforce planning, higher wages for the people working in it. It's a mess. But I also think there's a kind of community element to this as well, because we talk about this in the context of a system all the time, when actually we're talking about caring for our elderly relatives. And there's lots of families where actually people would like granny to stay with them for longer, but can't. And actually there are relatively small things I think you could do with the tax system to give incentives to allow people to adapt to their homes, to allow people to stay at home for longer and take the pressure off residential care that way.
I think if you had put Nick and myself on some kind of immigration debate, it would have been very fiery. But you were onto something in 2017, and you're right, it wasn't popular, but you were saying the unspeakable bit out loud, which is that social care is a crucial element of healthcare. It has been underfunded for a very, very long time. It is falling apart. You have to find the money from somewhere. Where is the fairest place to find that cash? And it goes back to the point of this panel. Unless we're willing to talk about spending, we can't start talking about tax cuts when you have a multi-billion-pound black hole in the social care budget. You know, until you figure out how you're going to fill that, and the fairest way to fill that, then you can't really be talking about tax cuts. And because of other crazy distortions in the UK, like the housing market, people have so much of their money and their inheritance tied up in their home. So the idea that you would target the home is very uncomfortable for people, but also, frankly, when it comes to how people might play some level in costing their own care, that is also what you might start talking about. But it's one distortion knocking on to another, and it leads, I think, politically, as we saw, to very difficult places. I think the conversation has to begin basically with people under the age of 40. So part of the problem is bringing in that change at a time where people are really truly starting to think about their retirement. And I think even somebody at 45 or 50, it's probably that political change is coming too late. We need to be a lot more honest with my generation and the ones below that things like the state pension, things like social care, things like the NHS are probably going to look very different. And you're going to have to make some really big pledges to those generations, probably around tax. Because if you want them funding the generations above them to have those services, if you want them saving for themselves and preparing to spend more themselves, you're going to have to give somewhere. But that conversation is going to have to happen. 2017 perhaps wasn't the time, but the point is a really important one. You have to find the money somewhere.
Great.
Sorry, can I just...
Sorry, go on. Please do.
Just on social care, I think the problem with having this conversation with the public is that people have until they actually have to interact with the social care system, people don't understand how it actually works at the moment. I think people believed that it was like the NHS, that it would cover you for free, and actually didn't realise that the reality is at the moment, if you are unlucky enough to have severe dementia that requires years of intensive care, you will lose your home anyway. You will be expected to use that money to pay for it. So I think when these proposals for reform were being presented, people were comparing it to, I think at the moment the state just has me covered and my wealth is my own. And actually that's not the reality of the current situation, but it makes it hard to engage people on realistic choices. I was quite persuaded by the sort of Dilnot take on this, that what people find hard to provide for themselves is to cover the real extreme tail risk that you are that person who needs years of intensive care. So I was quite persuaded by the argument that actually that's really where there's a role for the state, and people can insure themselves privately for that sort of the normal type of care you might expect, and then it's the state to pick up the tail.
Great. More questions. I might take 3 this time because we have about just under 10 minutes left. Could we get a question from the gentleman in the front here? And the front here. And one from the back there. Thank you.
When are we going to, David Lloyd, when are we going to start deciding that we want to really have a social movement about people, allowing people to spend their own money, rather than saying, because if you go around every single room in this conference at the moment, it'll be about how we spend the money which the state has got. You know, we've got to a point where, for goodness sake, the government was even saying that we should have a football regulator, something which, frankly, has got nothing whatsoever to do with the state. When are we really going to start going out? And how are we going to start going out and winning that argument? Because whilst we only talk about the money which is spent, it's always going to be difficult to then talk about tax cuts, because that always seems to be, or tax, because that always seems to be the obvious place. We need to change the reference of the argument so that we're saying we would prefer you to spend your money rather than us having to get involved with it at all.
Is the question then that is the government focusing on the right priorities, and is the question too focused on spend?
I think the question actually is, how do we create the movement which says it's a really positive thing to be able to spend your own money? That's what I think we need to be doing.
Cool. Question here. Thank you.
Which new taxes or giveaways the Labour government potentially introduces will be the hardest to remove?
Ooh, good question.
Sorry, what was the question?
Hardest to remove?
Which potential new taxes or giveaways the current Labour government potentially will produce in the future, which will be the hardest to remove?
Okay.
And we had a final question.
The ratchet effect of socialism, as Thatcher used to call it.
Cool. And a final question there.
Yeah, I think we've spoken about PAYE and NIC being merged. Let's assume that's one simplification that you kind of, I think, all agree on. What would be another one, another tax simplification that would be revenue neutral? That I'm probably looking more at the economists, but yeah, any other tax simplification?
Cool. So we have a question on government spend here, a question on which new taxes are the hardest to get rid of. We know that bad taxes often tend to stay around for a long time. And a question on what tax simplification policies are we currently missing. Shall we go in reverse order, start with the third question and end with the first? So I'll defer to Gemma and Aaron.
So I would say, picking up on what Kate said earlier, if the next tax simplification on my list, and would have been my second one if I got two, was to scrap stamp duty, which is a really bad tax. And from a revenue neutral perspective, I mean, you can do it from any other source of revenue you want. A fairly natural one, given that we've said council tax already is badly designed, is to sort out the taxation of land and property in this country in general. Like, it's not designed very well. There's a good case anyway for a form of council tax. You could do these two things alongside each other. So it's all about houses, but you're rebalancing in a way that gets rid of the nonsense of the way that stamp duty works right now.
Yeah, I mean, I would have picked similar ones. On council tax, it does seem mad that we have a tax that's not at all proportional to property values and then based on property values in 1991. So you could do a reform that would raise no more money, but it would raise it from different places. It's clearly a redistribution to places outside London and the South East, which are where property prices have gone up most significantly. But that would be a more rational system that would be proportional.
It is similar to what exists in the US. I mean, it's similar to what exists in most other countries. Most countries have some tax on property, and most of them are not necessarily precisely proportional to their exact value, but you have sort of bands, and they increase with the value of property. And there is some process of revaluation. Some do it, which I think creates some lock-in at the point that you sell the house. That's not ideal. But more often, there's just a sort of like 5-yearly revaluation. And so as property prices change, we're reflecting that in the amount of tax you're paying.
And there are, I mean, the obvious objections to that are people who have low incomes in high-value properties, but there are ways you could get around that by rolling up the liabilities until you sell the house, for example, would be one way of addressing that.
Although it's worth saying, just very briefly on that point, it depends where you are as a Conservative, because one answer is you want to roll it up so that Granny can stay in her 4-bedroom house in Kensington that she's owned for her whole life. The other answer is that maybe she shouldn't live in a 4-bedroom house in Kensington, and there are other people who would make better use of that thing, and there's just different views that people take on this. But it is worth saying, sometimes sometimes the answer is that there are Conservatives who will say, actually, what we want to do is to try to preserve people's current situation. There are times where you say, okay, actually, what would the market be saying? If it's the same as a price mechanism, right? Like, there's a price for that housing. If you're in that house, someone else is not in the house.
Well, I think there are also two ways to look at it. Of course, somebody with liberty, freedom-loving tendencies does not want to force somebody out of the home that they love. The other difficulty is, what if you look at the tax system and say, I think quite rightly in many of these circumstances, why are we subsidizing somebody to stay there? Right? So if we are artificially keeping costs like council tax low on a home like that, we are subsidizing somebody to stay in their property, and somebody else is picking up that bill. Ideally, we'd be building 1 million homes yesterday, and this would be less of a conversation because people would have real choice. In the meantime, I think it's very difficult to say to somebody who's perhaps on a lower wage or an average wage that their tax bill is going up to keep somebody else in their very lovely grand home. That's tricky. So I don't think it's in any way socialist policy to say that. You're completely right to say that the Conservative Party, as it has these conversations, right, is going to come to different conclusions on what the right public policy is. But something's got to change on housing because it's not quite working. Can I take the question about what's going to be hardest to roll back?
Please do.
Public sector pay, right? It's done. It's never going down. It's a yearly spend. It's not a one-off spend. That's going to go up. Now, the IFS did a great. They're doing their green budget, and they released a great report last week, a chapter of their green budget on public sector pay. and on pensions. And, you know, the public sector has not had an easy time when it's come to pay. And to go back to your point, our new GP over here, doctors and nurses, GPs, they are not paid as badly as a lot of the narrative would tell you they are, but you're not paid terribly well compared to international standards. And I think it's a travesty, to be honest. I think you should have, I think ideally the UK would have much better pay for their doctors and nurses. I think ideally you would have a leaner, but quite well remunerated public sector, especially in the civil service. You want to retain and keep some of the top talent, and at the moment that's actually incredibly difficult to do. You have to get efficiency gains and you have to get better productivity for those pay raises, and that's where I think Labour's gone so badly wrong, is they haven't asked for anything. Those costs are only going to continue to go up, and now the assumption is, and Labour have brought this upon themselves, it's just that it's a handout. You know, it's a pay raise with nothing attached to it. I mean, it's been remarkable to see some of the campaigns around NHS strikes saying, you know, we're going to accept this payment and we'll be back next year. And when does that end? And, you know, the Tories they weren't terribly successful in their campaign to push back on public sector pay raises. But I think that element is needed. I would really recommend this IFS chapter where they talk about the disproportionately high pensions that public sector workers get, and perhaps redistributing some of that into their income so they can have the cash now, and we get public pensions more in line with private pensions in the future.
Great. I think I will have to wrap up. I'm sorry we didn't get to your final question, but we've run out of time. 3 quick thank yous. Thank you all for making it here today. Thank you to Syntax for supporting this event, and to our panelists for a fantastic conversation.